Hello everyone, welcome to this lesson on pulse rate and breathing rate during exercise. Our learning objective today is to explain how to measure and monitor pulse rate, breathing rate and our recovery time. Our keywords for today are pulse, beats, blood, breathe, normal and baseline. Okay, so before we start, your do now questions are in your notebook, so please answer these 4 questions. Pause the video while you do that and then we will go through the answers. Okay, so the answer to question 1, alpha radiation is the most ionizing of the 3. The function of the mitochondria is that they are where respiration takes place, or you may have put they release energy. Both would be correct. Number 3, it's the right side of the heart that carries deoxygenated blood. And number 4, cardiovascular disease is the term we use to describe the issue of having fatty buildup in the arteries of the heart. Okay, so these are the things we are going to go through in our learning journey today. By the end of the lesson, you should have an awareness of how we monitor pulse and breathing rate, and you should also be able to use data on pulse and breathing rate to understand what's happening before, during and after exercise. So what is our pulse? You may have had your pulse taken if you've been to the doctors. Just under the skin in our wrist and in our neck, we can actually feel a pulsing sensation using our fingers. That's known as your pulse. And the pulse is the feeling of blood rushing through valves in your veins. And each time your blood pulses, it's actually a beat of your heart that you are effectively feeling. So our pulse rate tells us the number of times our heart beats in a minute. As I said, it's blood pulsing through blood vessels close to the surface of your skin that you're actually feeling when you take your pulse or somebody else's pulse. And a normal pulse rate for a child when they're just sat doing nothing is around 80 beats per minute. It can vary, but if you're sat at rest, then for a teenager it's going to be around 80 beats per minute. So we can take our pulse. You can you can try this now by placing your first, second and third fingers just towards the top part of your wrist and just pressing gently. You may need to just fiddle around a little bit and move your fingers up and down, but you should feel a slight pulsing sensation under the skin. I find it useful to actually place my thumb underneath my wrist and just gently squeeze my thumb and fingers together, and that's just about the right pressure to feel the pulse. So that's one way that we can take our pulse. Another way is to take our neck pulse. So again, tips of your fingers just on either side of your neck, just to one side of your windpipe, your trachea. And if you just press lightly, you should be able to feel a gentle pulsing. Okay, so that is how we take our pulse. And it's worth pausing the video and practicing that now if you're struggling, because you're going to be taking your pulse and measuring it later in the lesson. Okay, an important point to remember when we are measuring heart and breathing rate is that rather than count the heart rate for 60 seconds, if we want to know what our heart rate is right now, we just count it for 15 seconds and then we multiply that by 4 to get our pulse rate per minute. The reason we do that is that our heart rate and breathing rate can change quite quickly. So for example, if we wanted to know what our heart rate was immediately after stopping exercise and we counted our heart rate for 60 seconds, by the time we've got to the end of that 60 seconds, our heart rate will have changed quite a lot. So If we just count it for 15 seconds and then multiply that number by 4, we get an or more accurate measure of our heart rate at that point in time. The same applies to breath rate. If you're counting the number of times you breathe per minute, we will generally do that for 15 seconds and then times by 4. Okay, you've got a couple of review questions to answer now in your notebook. So pause the video, answer the questions, and then start it again for the answers. Okay, I'm going to go through the answers now. So our pulse rate tells you how many times your heart is beating per minute. And we count it for 15 seconds instead of 60, so that we know the heart rate at a given point in time. Given that the longer we're counting for, the greater the chance that the heart rate will actually change. Okay, so we should now have an awareness of how we monitor pulse and breathing rate. We're now moving on to what happens to our pulse and breathing rate during exercise and using data to describe that. So, what can our pulse tell us? Well, it can tell us how hard our heart's working, and it can tell us how healthy and fit we are. You don't need to write this down, but just pause the video and have a think about these two questions. How do you think our heart rate can tell us how hard the heart's working? And what other changes do you notice when you exercise? Pause the video and then come back for the answers. Okay, well, our heart rate can tell us how hard our heart is working by looking at the speed. If you're working harder, for example, when you're exercising, then your pulse rate will generally get quicker. So if you know what your pulse rate is when you're resting, and then you take your pulse rate when you're exercising, you can see how much harder the heart is working. It can tell us how healthy and fit we are too, in that generally speaking, fitter and healthy people will have slower heart rates. And actually, if you measure your heart rate after exercise and then measure it again a few minutes later, you can see how much your heart rate has recovered. And generally speaking, people who are fit and healthy will have quicker recovery times as well as a slower heart rate at rest. What other changes do you notice when you exercise? Well, hopefully you said things like sweating and getting out of breath, and our breathing rate is something else we've talked about. So important points to note then, just generally, fitter people have got a lower resting heart rate and a short recovery time after exercise. So I'm sure you've all felt that your breathing rate and your heart rate goes up when you exercise and then starts to slow down again when you stop. If you are a fit person, generally it doesn't take as long for your heart and breathing rate to return to normal as it would in somebody who is unfit. Okay, we're going to do a bit of practical now, and I'm going to ask you to get a bit active. If you want to go outside to do this, you can, but you can exercise indoors. If the weather's horrid or you can't go out for any reason, then stay indoors. You are going, as the part of our next practical activity, you are going to be required to do something active for about 5 minutes. So if you want to pause the video now and find a pair of shoes to go outside or whatever, then now would be a good time to do that, and then come back to the video for your instructions. So we're going to be measuring the effects of exercise on our heart rate and our breathing rate. You're going to record your results in the results tables in your notebook, okay? You don't need to record anything while you're actually exercising, okay? So you don't need to worry about how you're going to get anything written down or measured while you're exercising. All your measuring is going to be done before and after. The first thing you want to do is measure your heart rate at rest, okay? So you're just going to sit down and measure your heart rate by counting your pulse beats for 15 seconds and then multiplying that number by 4. And then you're going to do 5 minutes of exercise. If you can't go outside, it could be absolutely anything indoors, jogging on the spot, star jumps, stick a record on and dance around your room like a lunatic, or you can go outside and just have a brisk walk or skip or run or whatever you fancy doing. You're going to do that for 5 minutes. And then at the end of that 5 minutes, you're going to measure your heart rate again. And you're going to do that every minute for 9 minutes. Okay? And remember, you're going to measure it for 15 seconds and then multiply that number by 4 in order to get your heart rate. And then you're going to do exactly the same again, but this time you're going to measure your breathing rate. Okay, so again, you're going to sit and relax, take your breathing rate for 1 minute, or rather for 15 seconds, and multiply by 4, then do some exercise, and then come back and measure your breathing rate every minute for 9 minutes. So you'll see in your notebook that you have got tables to record your exercises. So this is the table that you've got for your heart rate or your pulse rate. So remember, before you start, to take what's called your resting pulse rate. So that's your beats per minute when you're sat doing nothing, and you'll record that at the top. Then you're going to exercise for 5 minutes. And then every minute you are going to record your pulse rate. So 0 minutes after exercise means as soon as you stop. So you'll do it as soon as you stop, then you'll do it 1 minute after, then 2 minutes after, then 3 minutes after, and so on. And what I would suggest you do, unless you're really quick with a calculator or your mental maths, is that you just focus on writing down the first column results. So your pulse rate in the 15 seconds, just do that, and then worry about doing the calculations, the multiply by 4 afterwards. Okay, now before you go, let's look at the next slide. The next slide is the other results table you've got in your notebook. You might need to scroll across in the notebook to the right hand side to see this one, because I've put them level with each other on the notebooks. Okay, so this is the one you're going to do your breathing rate. Okay, if you think you can be clever and measure both at the same time, by all means try, but I wouldn't recommend it. I'd recommend doing your heart rate after the first 5 minutes of activity, and then repeating the experiment doing your breathing rate. So when you are ready, pause the video, take your resting heart rate, then do your exercise, and then come back and do your measurements. Okay, if at this point you are not clear on what you need to do for the experiment, pause the video and send a message on the chat, or ask your teacher on the live lesson if you're on one. Okay, all right, I'm going to let you go and do your practical and then come back to the video when you're ready. Welcome back. I hope you enjoyed your practical and got some exercise. We're now going to plot a line graph with 2 lines on it. One is going to represent your breathing and one is going to represent your pulse. You're then going to describe your graph, and then you've got some questions to answer. So on the screen now you can see a picture of a line graph which has got 2 different coloured lines of best fit on it. This is just a sketched graph to give you an idea as to what I'm expecting yours to look like. So you will need to pick one colour to plot your pulse or heart rate results, and one colour to plot your breathing results. Now you won't just be drawing terrible squiggly lines like mine, you will be plotting the individual points for your pulse rate, and then drawing a line of best fit through those points, and then plotting individual points for your breathing rate, and doing another line of best fit for your breathing in a different colour. So you will end up with a graph that looks something like this, but with the individual points plotted on as well. If you're not sure how to do it, then your teacher will be able to help you. So once you've plotted that graph, you've got some questions underneath the graph which you're going to answer. The first one is going to be describing what your graph is telling you. The second one is going to be, the next one will be answering what happens to your pulse and breathing rate as you recover from exercise. You could look to see how much time it takes for your heart and breathing rate to recover to its resting rate. And lastly, how could you improve your recovery time? So what did we say about good recovery time? Does good recovery time mean you are fitter or less fit, and how could you improve it? So you now need to complete the graph, answer the questions below it, and then hand your work in. And now that you've done all that, or by the time you've done all that, you should have an awareness of how we monitor pulse and breathing, and also be able to look at the data on your graph to describe what's happening to pulse rate and breathing before, during, and after exercise. Once you've done that, hand your work in. Thank you.